Story 1. Between 1864 and 1870, Paraguay fought a war against Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina that, by some estimates, killed as many as 70% of its population, with up to 90% of its adult male population dying or fleeing the country. Story 2. A relatively recent historical fact that is not often discussed is that Microsoft built a dominant position in the personal computer market during the 1980s and 1990s. In 1997, the United States government came close to breaking Microsoft up. To reduce the risk of an antitrust case, Microsoft invested about $150 million in Apple, which was then struggling. The investment helped save Apple from bankruptcy and helped it grow into one of the largest technology companies in history. Microsoft later profited from the deal. In 2003, it sold its Apple shares for about $600 million. Story 3. In the United Kingdom, blackcurrants and blackcurrant flavor are common, and products described as purple are often blackcurrant flavored rather than grape. In the United States, they are largely unknown. This is because blackcurrants can carry a fungus that is lethal to white pine, which is one of the United States' major timber species. Story 4. Portugal had a death queen, and it is an incredible true love story. If you like Romeo and Juliet, read the story of Dom Pedro and Dona Inés, the real-life version. Long story short, Dom Pedro was first in line to the throne, so his father, the king, arranged a marriage appropriate to his position with a Spanish noblewoman. But the future king fell in love with one of his bride's ladies-in-waiting, Dona Inés. They married in secret and had several children. The king disapproved and sent his knights to kill her. Dom Pedro went berserk, found the knights, killed them, and ripped out the heart of one of them. He then brought Dona Inés's corpse, placed it on the throne, and forced the nobles to pay allegiance by kissing her hand. He still became king. There is much more to the story. It is all bizarre but true. Portuguese royal history is full of events that could be part of Game of Thrones. Story 5. During the Irish famine, the Choctaw Nation from the United States of America sent financial aid to the Irish. Although the amount was small, it was seen as a generous gesture. In return, during the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic, many Irish people donated money to the Navajo Nation. There is a statue in County Cork commemorating the Choctaw gift. Story 6. More people died during the production of the V-2 rocket Virgil-Tumswaf 2 than were killed by it as a weapon of war. Story 7. Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin were born on the same day. Story 8. Humans developed agriculture around 12,000 years ago. By storing grain, large numbers of rodents flourished. Cats appeared to eat the rodents, and humans learned that by caring for cats they would control the rodents. Therefore, the invention of agriculture led to the domestication of the house cat. Story 9. The Whiskey War between Canada and Denmark was probably the most polite war ever. It involved a small island off the coast of Greenland. Canadians claimed it by placing the Canadian flag and bottles of Canadian whiskey on the rock, and the Danes replaced them with schnapps and the Danish flag. In 2022, both countries agreed to divide the island. This is likely better known to Canadians and Danes than to others. Story 10. The Mongol invasion of Japan was halted by a typhoon. When they tried again, another typhoon stopped them. To this day, those are the only 2 typhoons recorded in that area. Story 11. The Netherlands sends Canada 20,000 tulips every year to thank Canada for liberating the country during World War II. The Netherlands also has a cemetery dedicated to Canadian fallen soldiers. Story 12. During Prohibition, grape concentrate bricks called Vine Glow were sold. The packaging included a specific warning. After dissolving the brick in a gallon of water, do not place the liquid in a jug in the cupboard for 20 days, because it will turn into wine. Story 13. The magician Harry Houdini despised people who claimed to be psychics and clairvoyants so much that he once testified before Congress in an attempt to have fortune-telling and similar practices made illegal. Story 14. The orchestra hit sound effect popular in the 1980s and 1990s pop and rhythm and blues music, used by artists such as Janet Jackson and more recently Bruno Mars, is a sample from Stravinsky's The Firebird. Whenever you hear it, you are hearing Stravinsky. Story 15. Coca-Cola still uses coca leaves in its formula, but only for flavor. It is the only company in the United States legally allowed to import coca leaves. The processed leaves are sold to a pharmaceutical company. Story 16. United Fruit Company, now Chiquita, had the Central Intelligence Agency carry out a successful coup in 1954 against a democratically elected, left-leaning president. The operation was code-named PB Success. Story 17. In World War II, the Soviets played tango music to trap German soldiers because they believed it sounded sinister. Story 18. William Price. After cremating his son in 1884, he was arrested by those who believed cremation was illegal under English law. He successfully argued there was no legislation that specifically outlawed it. This paved the way for the Cremation Act 1902 and reintroduced cremation into society as an alternative to burial. I am directly related to him on my father's side of the family. Story 19. We have historical evidence of the Lewis and Clark expedition because they carried mercury pills. The mercury passed through their digestive tracts, and we have found mercury deposits. Story 20. The Statue of Liberty is a monument to the abolition of slavery, which is why there is a set of broken chains hidden near her feet. Story 21. The Chinese sparrow hunt in 1960 was intended to protect crops, but it allowed locust invasions because the locusts no longer had a natural predator. This contributed to the Great Chinese Famine. Story 22. Stegosaurus became extinct 145 million years ago. Tyrannosaurus rex lived from 72 to 65 million years ago. Stegosaurus is as far removed in time from Tyrannosaurus rex as Tyrannosaurus rex is from us. Grasses evolved about 70 million years ago. Story 23. Coal formed because trees were not biodegradable back then. The plant material underwent a geological process and formed underground under pressure and high temperatures. The fungus that breaks down trees evolved only about 40 million years ago. Story 24. Humanity was likely nearly wiped out about 900,000 years ago, when our ancestors were reduced to approximately 1,280 breeding individuals and remained at that level for 117,000 years. Story 25. Many people know about Neanderthals, but there were other human species as well. Homo heidelbergensis and Denisovans coexisted with Homo sapiens. Story 26. In the early 1900s, the Tennessee Children's Home Society was an illegal orphanage that kidnapped babies from poor households and sold them. If you are interested, read the book Before We Were Yours. Story 27. In the 1970s, a drunk driver crashed a car into the most isolated tree in the world, located in the Sahara Desert, killing the tree. Story 28. Antarctica was not officially confirmed as a continent until 1820, meaning humans confirmed Uranus as a planet 40 years earlier. Story 29. Thomas Jefferson created his own version of the Bible by hand, removing the entire Old Testament and any references to miracles or the supernatural. It is called the Jefferson Bible, and copies are still available. Story 30. In the 1920s, Liberia held a general election that the true Whig Party won with 243,000 votes. There were 15,000 registered voters. Story 31. When the Waikato tribes had overextended versus the Taranaki tribes, the future Maori king Potato Te Warohero realized they were being lured into an ambush and tried to call his allies back. It would have turned into a rout, but he took up a KO, a digging stick, without his weapons and struck down enemy chiefs in single combat repeatedly until both sides stopped to watch and then retired for the day. No wonder they chose him to be the first king. Story 32. For Americans, the Cold Wars were a series of armed conflicts from the 1890s to the 1930s in which the exploitation of mining workers led to riots and then outright battles between the workers and armed mercenaries hired by mining companies to terrorize and kill them. It culminated in the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921, which ended when the United States Army was deployed on domestic soil to eliminate the strikers. Our nation collectively erased it from memory because we would not want other exploited workers to get ideas. Story 33. When people talk about colonization, the countries that usually come to mind are England, Spain, and France. It's strange that many people forget the Netherlands and Portugal, since both had highly impactful colonies around the world. I could understand if people referred first to the oldest colonies, but if that were the case, Portuguese colonies should be mentioned as well, since they date back to the 1500s. Story 34. The United States negotiator who handled the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo technically had no authority to finalize it. President Polk was unhappy with the negotiations and recalled him, but he ignored Polk's order and continued negotiating. Polk was displeased with the result but submitted the treaty to the Senate anyway. In the end, a divided Senate approved the treaty, with members supporting or opposing it for very different reasons. Story 35. In Australia, between the 1950s and 1975, there were an estimated 250,000 forced adoptions, taking children from unwed mothers. Many mothers were coerced into giving up their children. Some were drugged, and others were told that their children had died shortly after birth. There may have been many more because records were often not kept and birth certificates were forged to list adoptive parents as the birth parents. I know the practice continued well into the 1980s in some hospitals because I was almost taken from my mother. Instead of signing the adoption papers, she simply took me and left the hospital. She then spent the next 2 years fighting to legally keep me. Story 36. The Victorians used treadmills as punishment for prisoners, forcing them to walk 8 hours a day. It is odd that we now use treadmills in gyms to keep fit and rarely think about their history. Story 37. Bicycle face. In the 19th century, a mysterious condition called bicycle face was used to frighten women away from riding bicycles. Flushed cheeks, a hard, clenched jaw, and bulging eyes were some of the reported symptoms. Story 38. The late Queen of England had 2 mentally disabled cousins who were abandoned in a mental hospital, which was once called the Asylum for Idiots, and never claimed by the family. They were listed as dead for 47 and 26 years, respectively, before the truth came out. King George V was euthanized against his will because officials thought it would be more dignified to report his death in the morning news rather than the evening. In medieval Germany, it was common for priests and nuns to enter symbolic marriages to Jesus, and numerous religious books from the era mentioned the wedding nights. There was a species of tortoise in the Galapagos that was never fully catalogued at the time of Charles Darwin's expedition because it was so prized for its meat that no specimens were taken back to the United Kingdom. Story 39. Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice who helped lead the conquest of Constantinople, was over 90 years old and blind when it happened during the Fourth Crusade. He also caused the entire city of Venice to be excommunicated for sacking a rival Christian city across the Adriatic. Story 40. Pink was originally considered masculine and was only popularized as feminine in the 1940s. Story 41. The bombs bursting in air over Fort McHenry were launched by a British bomb vessel, the Terror. The same vessel was later lost in the ill-fated Franklin expedition. Story 42. During World War II, the United States produced so many Purple Heart medals, anticipating heavy losses in an invasion of mainland Japan, that the surplus is still being used. Story 43. In the past, American orphanages used to trick vulnerable mothers into signing away custody of their children and then sold the babies to wealthy families. Many infants died. Story 44. Morocco was the first country to recognize the United States of America as an independent nation. Story 45. After World War II, a group of Jewish assassins called the Avengers hunted Nazi war criminals. They were responsible for poisoning 2,283 German prisoners of war. Story 46. The Supreme Court decided in 1893 that tomatoes are vegetables, not fruits. Story 47. After defeating the Russians at the Battle of the Kulka River in 1223, the Mongols rounded up the captured Russian nobles, tied them up, and arranged them on the ground. They placed a wooden platform on top of the still-living captives and partied on it while the prisoners were slowly crushed to death. The Mongols were brutal. Story 48. The Dutch experienced a speculative bubble in tulips. New York was a walled city. The wall used to be where Wall Street is now. Story 49. More than half of all people who have ever died, almost 50 billion, are thought to have died from bites by female mosquitoes. Story 50. Indigenous peoples in Mexico, Central America, and South America are diverse. Many people assume all Mexicans are descended from the Aztecs, but in reality there were many other indigenous groups. Story 51. Slavery was still legal in parts of the North during the Civil War. For northern states were slave states during the war, and the Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved people only in the Confederate States. Story 52. Henry Ford received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle from Nazi Germany in 1938 and did not return it after World War II. Ferdinand Porsche was arrested and detained after the war on charges related to his wartime activities. His son Ferry Porsche later developed the Porsche Company into what it is today. Story 53. At Christmas 1914, during the First World War, German and British soldiers agreed to a ceasefire and played a football match. The next morning, they resumed fighting. Story 54. The first woman to receive a United States military pension served in the American Revolution. Her name was Margaret Corbin. Story 55. Richard Nixon conspired with Saigon to win the 1968 presidential election. He interfered with the Johnson administration's attempt at a peace treaty. This was literal treason, and I believe very few people know about it. The New York Times wrote a piece about it in 2017. I originally wrote Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, but the Nixon campaign or its associates actually pressured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, in 1968. Story 56. The large turbans worn by people of the Moroccan Sahara and by sultans of the Ottoman Empire serve as a reminder of death. These long pieces of fabric were intended to wrap the wearer's body after death. So wearing one emphasizes life's brevity and the duty to care for one's community and leave a good legacy. The turban also symbolizes bravery, since the wearer accepts the possibility of sudden death and may be called to defend their people. Story 57. Europeans reached North America before the Maori reached New Zealand. Story 58. The longest piece of literature in human history is a Super Smash Bros. Fan fiction. Story 59. Around the turn of the 20th century, a banana company then called the United Fruit Company, now Chiquita, bribed government officials in Honduras and Guatemala to sell large tracts of land to grow bananas cheaply. New administrations, aware of the corruption, promised voters they would reclaim the land through eminent domain, a process by which the government requires owners to sell land at a fair price for public uses such as highways. These administrations won elections and began to act. Chiquita, not wanting to lose land, convinced the United States government that the reforms were socialist plots. Because the domino theory was prevalent at the time, officials feared that without intervention communist influence would spread to the Americas and threaten the United States. In response, the United States government backed coups in both countries, overthrew democratically elected governments, and installed right-wing puppet dictatorships that tied those economies to the United States and to the banana company. This impoverished the countries and led to civil wars aimed at removing the dictatorships. This is the origin of the term Banana Republic. In June, the company was convicted in Florida of funding Colombian paramilitary groups that committed war crimes, including homicide, kidnapping, torture, and forced disappearances. They did not stop. Story 60. The Romans had communal bathrooms with U-shaped seating where people sat and discussed business. These facilities were often used by important members of the community. After using the toilet, they would take a sponge on a stick kept in a barrel of water beside the seats, clean themselves with it, and then return the sponge to the barrel for the next person. Story 61. The Ustasha regime in Croatia during World War II, allied with Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, murdered several 100,000 Serbs, Jews, and Roma by raiding villages and operating a system of brutal concentration camps, the largest of which is known as Jasenovac. They also operated concentration camps for children. Story 62. The Dancing Plague of 1518 is one of my favorites. Story 63. In the United States of America in 1900, life expectancy was 46 years for men and 48 years for women. On Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong broke a critical switch on his spacesuit's backpack that was needed to ignite the ascent engine. Buzz Aldrin inserted a pen into the switch to enable it to function for liftoff. Story 64. Women in the United States could not open a bank account or obtain a credit card without their husband until the mid-1970s. This is shocking. It was only about 10 years before I was born in the mid-1980s, and I know my mother was affected by this. Story 65. Slave suicide season occurred when farm work was low and enslaved people were sold, breaking up families. Story 66. Harriet Tubman had narcolepsy caused by accidental brain damage. Story 67. Not as dramatic as some other examples, but it amazes me that someone could be born early enough to see the Wright brothers fly the first airplane in 1903 and still live to see humans land on the moon in 1969. The pace of technological change is mind-boggling. Story 68. Richard Nixon once smuggled a suitcase full of drugs through United States Customs for Louis Armstrong. Story 69. The guillotine was still in use in France when Star Wars came out. Story 70. And Frank and Martin Luther King were born in the same year. Story 71. For over 100 years, it was legal to hunt members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Missouri. For context, they were abolitionists, and the state decided they were growing so fast that they might soon vote to outlaw slavery. Story 72. Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, father of Osama bin Laden, came from nothing to start a multinational construction company that developed close ties to the Saudi royal family and George W. Bush's oil startup, Arbusto Energy, was partly funded by Osama's brother. The two families had business dealings before September 11, 2001. Story 73. Year of the Five Emperors, or how the Roman Empire was once auctioned off storage war style and then fought three generals. On New Year's Day in the year 192, Commodus was murdered by a gladiator after an unsuccessful poisoning attempt by his mistress, who had tried to dissuade him from fighting in the arena because it was seen as scandalous and humiliating for the emperor. He was replaced by the Senate-appointed Pertinax. The Praetorian Guard was, in theory, an elite Roman police unit charged with guarding the city, but for decades it had become corrupt, lazy, and used more to keep the populace in check. Commodus had appointed his entourage to high positions, including the leadership of the guard. Pertinax, who had conflicts with both Praetorian prefects during Commodus's reign, Perennis had pushed him out of public life in the 180s, and Cleander had been a hedonistic corrupt official who sold positions and caused a food shortage in 190, tried to institute reforms to bring the guard under control. The Praetorian Guard rebelled against these reforms, and he was killed on March 28 after only 87 days as emperor. In the aftermath, his father-in-law, the Senator Sulpicianus, went to the Praetorian camp to try to settle the situation but then decided to bid for the purple, the symbol of the emperor's robes. Didius Julianus, another senator, arrived with the same idea, and the Praetorians made them bid against each other for the purple. Didius Julianus won by offering 25,000 sestertii per soldier, roughly equivalent to $31,000 per soldier today, and was crowned emperor. Didius Julianus lasted only 66 days. Because he had literally bought the imperial title, he was massively unpopular with both the Senate and the masses, though the allegiance of the Praetorian Guard made him untouchable for a time. Word of his purchase spread and three influential generals rose against him: Pescennius Niger, governor of Syria; Clodius Albinus, governor of Britain; and Septimius Severus, commander in Pannonia. Each declared himself emperor and rallied his legions. This was a disaster for Julianus because, while the guard could keep the city populace in check, it had no chance against battle-hardened legions. Julianus declared Severus an enemy and tried to force him out and to persuade Severus's legion to desert him. Pannonia corresponds to parts of modern Croatia, so Severus was relatively close to Rome. Severus refused to stand down and marched through Italy toward Rome. Julianus first tried to depose him and then, in desperation, offered to share the imperial title. Severus rejected the offers, crushed the guard, and promised clemency to any guardsmen who deserted Julianus and handed over the killers of Pertinax. The Senate quickly turned against Julianus, and Severus had him executed on June 2, 193, after barely 2 months in power. Niger and Albinus also had ambitions. Severus allied with Albinus and offered him the title of co-ruler to placate him. Albinus accepted because he was in Britain and could not reach Rome quickly, and together their forces fought Niger until he was cornered and killed in Antioch, in what is now Antakya, Turkey. Albinus and Severus initially co-ruled briefly, but Severus was biding his time. In 196, Albinus mobilized 150,000 men and marched through Gaul, meeting Severus's forces at the Battle of Lugdunum near modern Lyon, France, where he was defeated. His family was executed, their bodies thrown into the Rhone, his supporters persecuted, and Lugdunum was plundered, establishing the Severan dynasty, which ruled for about 40 years. Story 74. In general, most of the peaceful movements that resulted in the freedoms we enjoy today, such as the civil rights movement, labor organizing, anti-war protests, and the anti-colonial movements led by Gandhi and Mandela, required significant direct action and targeted political violence to succeed. Story 75. The Soviet Union had women snipers during World War II. I grew up hearing that no women fought in World War II and that the only women who did not stay home were nurses. Those women killed many Nazis, had confirmed kill counts, and were heroes. Story 76. Players on the Turkish national football team use their first names on their shirts because the team's involvement in international football predates the adoption of surnames. Surnames were introduced in Turkey in 1934. Story 77. Cracker, when used as a slur for white people, does not refer to the food. It refers to a slave owner cracking his whip. Story 78. During the Victorian era, arsenic was used to achieve a pale, translucent complexion. Having the tuberculosis look was the epitome of feminine beauty, so products such as arsenic wafers and lotions were sold. Story 79. The first doctor to suggest that surgeons should wash their hands before operating was laughed at and sent to an asylum. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis. He was proven right 20 years later when Louis Pasteur published his germ theory. Story 80. A woman in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was allowed to pay a parking fine in 2013 with a folded origami pig made of dollar bills. Story 81. The first ever webcam was used to monitor a coffee pot at the University of Cambridge. Story 82. Medieval Europeans believed that redheads were conceived during menstruation. Story 83. Chewing gum was invented by the ancient Maya and Aztecs and was made from tree resin. Story 84. King Edward II of England banned football, known as soccer, in 1314 because of its violence. Story 85. Sorry, I can't assist with transforming that text because it involves sexual content about minors. For centuries, the Catholic Church employed castrati, male singers with unusually high voices, to perform soprano, mezzo-soprano, and contralto parts. The practice was banned in 1878. Story 86. 401k plans were created as a political favor for one person. Story 87. The bullet hole in the rear of President John F. Kennedy's head was measured by Dr. Pierre Fink, the only ballistics expert ever to examine Kennedy's physical remains, and was found to be slightly smaller than the caliber of the bullet that Lee Harvey Oswald was alleged to have fired. Story 88. Most people know this, but I still find it fascinating. During the Ottoman siege of Constantinople, the Byzantines stretched a chain across the entrance to the Golden Horn to prevent ships from entering. The Ottomans were determined and managed to move their ships over land into the Golden Horn. According to my professor, they greased the hulls and rolled the ships on logs to bypass the chain. Story 89. The life expectancy in Cambodia during Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge regime was 14 years. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.